Good afternoon, Your Honor. Tin Ho on behalf of the people.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I will be providing the factual basis in regards to counts 2 and 3 as it relates to Brian and Katie Majori.
To understand how that was possible, you have to go back even further. Before Brian and Katie Major, there had been the break-ins. From 1974 to 1975, the small city of Visalia in California's Central Valley suffered more than 80 home burglaries. What made them strange wasn't the scale, it was the method. He didn't take electronics. He didn't take cash. He took photographs, personal items, things that had meaning only to the families who owned them. He was entering homes when no one was there and moving through the rooms slowly, unhurried, studying how these people lived, learning them. Investigators called him the Visalia Ransacker. They never caught him. Then, in 1976, the attacks shifted north to Sacramento's eastern suburbs. A man began breaking into homes at night and raping women while their husbands or boyfriends lay tied up on the floor nearby. He came through sliding glass doors and unlocked windows. He wore a mask. He wore gloves. He knew, with a precision that kept investigators awake at night, too much about police response patterns and radio frequencies and surveillance perimeters to have learned it anywhere other than from the inside. The time frame of the crimes, an FBI agent would say years later, supports that the suspect was a police officer when he committed some of these crimes. Sacramento called him the East Area Rapist. They never caught him either. Then in February 1978, he killed Brian and Katie Major, apparently because they saw something they weren't supposed to see, walking their dog near where he was operating. And by late 1979, he moved south. The rape stopped. Something worse started. For years, investigators in Northern and Southern California were hunting what they believed were two entirely separate criminals: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Two case files, two sets of detectives, two jurisdictions that didn't share information. They were looking for the same man. Nobody knew that yet. Not for 20 more years. On the night of March 13, 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were killed inside their home in Ventura County. Lyman was 43. He was a lawyer and weeks from being appointed to the Ventura County Superior Court bench. Charlene was 33. She decorated homes and ran a small jewelry business. Their daughter later described them simply: they were people who made the world around them better. Their killer came through a window in the night. He bound Charlene and sexually assaulted her with Lyman still in the bed beside her. Then he carried a log in from the firewood stacked outside their house and beat them both to death with it. Lyman's 12-year-old son, Gary, found them the next morning. Decades later, Jennifer Carroll, Lyman's daughter, who was 18 when her father died, stood in a courtroom and described what Gary walked into that bedroom. Her voice, by every account, was controlled and precise. It was the voice of someone who had spent decades managing the weight of a sentence before she finally had somewhere to put it. The walls were splattered with blood and gray matter, she said. Gary gently lifted the corner of the comforter to find my dad face down in the pillow, cemented to the fabric by blood. She had been briefly investigated as a suspect. At 18, she had been a person of interest in her own father's murder. "I've lived with the shame for decades," she told the man in the courtroom. "It's your shame, Joe." That moment was still 40 years away when Gary walked into his parents' bedroom. In August 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington were murdered in their bed in Dana Point, a gated community in Orange County. Keith was 24, a fourth-year medical student at UC Irvine. Patrice was 27, a pediatric nurse. They had been married only a few months. A neighbor described them as a quiet couple who had just started their life together. The kind of couple you'd see at the neighborhood pool, still learning each other's preferences, still choosing furniture together, still at the very beginning of what they thought was a long story. Their killer bludgeoned them to death and left almost nothing behind, which was the problem that would haunt every investigator who touched this case for the next 2 decades. The Southern California murders were clearly linked. The same method, the same bindings, the same signature, patience and silence and control. But the connection to the East Area Rapist in Sacramento was invisible. The case files were in different buildings, in different cities, with different sheriffs. Forensic DNA science did not yet exist in any form that could cross-reference biological evidence from 2 separate investigations happening in different eras and different counties. He moved freely through that gap, through the silence between filing cabinets. In May 1986, in Irvine, he attacked his last known victim. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old, home alone over a holiday weekend. The house quiet and unlocked in the way you leave a house when you live in a safe neighborhood and you're only going to be gone a few days. He raped her and beat her to death. Then the Golden State Killer was gone. No more attacks, no more evidence. Nothing but the open files and the families and the detectives who couldn't close the drawer and walk away. And somewhere out in California, not far, it would turn out, a man who knew exactly what he'd done, beginning whatever life came next. The years passed. The case didn't. In 2001, a forensic laboratory confirmed what investigators had long suspected but couldn't prove. The DNA from the Southern California murder scenes matched DNA from the East Area Rapist cases in Sacramento. 20 years of separate investigations, 20 years of detectives in different counties who didn't know they were hunting the same person, collapsed into a single file. 1 man, 12 murders, 50+ rapes, 11 counties. But they still had no name. His DNA profile entered the National Forensic Database. Nothing matched. He had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, which meant he had either been extraordinarily careful or extraordinarily lucky. And everyone who had studied his methods understood it wasn't luck. The man who stalked families for weeks before attacking them, who learned police radio channels, who wore gloves in 1974 when that was barely standard forensic knowledge. That man had not been caught because he had not made the kind of mistake that got people caught. He had made a different kind, a smaller one that wouldn't matter for another 17 years. That same year, 2001, a writer in Los Angeles named Michelle McNamara typed East Area Rapist into a search engine on a sleepless night and found a message board. She almost didn't stay. McNamara had grown up in Oak Park, Illinois. When she was 14, a woman was murdered 2 blocks from her house. The case was never solved. It left her, she would later write, with a particular feeling she could never quite name. Not fear exactly, but a sensitivity to the particular weight of an answer that never comes. The way an open question can live in a neighborhood, in a body, for years. She started reading the message board. Then she started reading the case files. Then she started calling detectives. She was meticulous in ways that earned her access most outsiders never got. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't theorize recklessly. She read, documented, cross-referenced. She earned the trust of investigators who had spent careers protecting sensitive information and who recognized in McNamara someone who understood that the case files contained real people, not narrative material. In 2013, she published a landmark long-form article in Los Angeles Magazine, In the Footsteps of a Killer, and in it she gave him the name that would follow him to the end, the Golden State Killer. The name did something that 40 years of local news coverage had failed to do. It unified the case in public consciousness. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, 3 nicknames for 3 eras of escalating violence, now understood as chapters in a single story. People who had never heard of the East Area Rapist learned the name Golden State Killer. Cold case communities, online forums, amateur investigators who had been circling the same evidence for years. Suddenly, they had a shared language and a renewed audience. In 2016, the FBI held a press conference, $50,000 reward, new composite sketches, a nationwide push. McNamara watched and kept working. She was up late most nights now. The research had settled into her in ways that were hard to describe to anyone outside it. The crime scene photographs that followed her into sleep, the suspect lists she cross-referenced until the hours blurred. Her husband noticed, her colleagues noticed. She was taking medication for the anxiety and the sleeplessness, combinations that required careful management. She wasn't managing carefully enough. On April 24, 2016, her husband, Patton Oswalt, found her in their bedroom. She was 46 years old. An undiagnosed heart condition, combined with the medications she'd been prescribed for the toll the case had taken on her body, had killed her in the night. Her book was 2/3 finished, and the man she had spent years hunting was alive. He was 70 years old, living in a beige house in the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights, 27 years into a warehouse job he had recently retired from. His neighbors described him as a regular person, quiet mostly, short temper. He never smiled. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Not yet. It wasn't a crime lab. It wasn't a federal database, or a new forensic technique, or a tip from an informant. It was a website built for people trying to find their grandmothers. GEDmatch was a free platform where amateur genealogists could upload their raw DNA data and compare it across different ancestry services. A way to find distant cousins, verify old family stories, trace heritage further than any single company's database allowed. By the mid-2010s, millions of people had voluntarily posted their genetic profiles there. They weren't thinking about crime. They were thinking about Ellis Island records and family reunions, and the grandmother who never talked about the old country. Nobody in law enforcement had seriously asked what that archive could do to a cold case. Paul Holes had. Holes was a forensic specialist at the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office who had spent years on the Golden State Killer case, longer than most people stayed with anything. He understood the limits of what they had. A DNA profile that was exquisitely detailed and completely useless without a name attached. CODAs required a match against a convicted offender. There were no convicted offenders related to the Golden State Killer in the system. Every door that existed had been opened. None of them led anywhere. And here is what that meant, practically. The killer had been protected for decades not by any action he'd taken since 1986, but by the simple fact that no one in his bloodline had ever been convicted of a crime serious enough to require a DNA sample. The database designed to catch people like him had never touched anyone near him. He was invisible inside the very system built to find him. GEDmatch wasn't a door. It was a different kind of architecture entirely. The logic, when Holes and his collaborators finally articulated it, was almost elegant. If even a distant relative of the killer had uploaded their DNA out of ordinary genealogical curiosity, a third cousin who wanted to know about a great-great-grandparent, the killer's profile might surface a genetic thread, not enough to identify him, enough to find the family tree he belonged to, and from there, working forward through generations, cross-referencing age and geography, and a dozen other variables, it might be possible to narrow the pool of candidates to something an investigator could actually surveil. The key insight was this: the killer himself never needed to be in the database. He never needed to have made a single mistake that law enforcement could see. All it required was one curious relative, one person who'd mailed away a saliva kit for Christmas, one distant cousin who wanted to know what percentage of their DNA was Scandinavian, and a thread would exist. A thread investigators could follow backward through time to the man himself. He had spent 40 years making sure no system could find him. He hadn't thought about the hobbyists. They had never done this before. No one had. There was no protocol, no precedent, no guarantee it would work. The investigators understood. They were attempting something that had no playbook, in a case that had broken everyone who had tried to crack it for 4 decades. Late in 2017, they uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to GEDmatch. The results came back within hours. Not a name. Not yet. Something more like a shape in the dark. Distant relatives, family branches stretching back into the 1800s, connecting through generations to a cluster of possible descendants in the right geography, the right era, the right gender. Investigators began building the trees forward, branch by branch, name by name, eliminating the ones that didn't fit the age range, the geography, the timeline of the crimes, following the ones that did. What they were doing in those weeks was constructing a net out of other people's family histories, tightening it slowly, methodically, generation by generation, around a man who didn't know he was inside it. They narrowed it to 3 names. One of them was Joseph James DeAngelo. When investigators pulled DeAngelo's file, things started connecting with a speed that made the room go quiet. He was 72, living in Citrus Heights, the same Sacramento suburb where the East Area Rapist had operated. He had been born in Bath, New York, in 1945, served in Vietnam, earned a degree in criminal justice from Sacramento State. From 1973 to 1976, he was a police officer in Exeter, California, a town 10 miles from Visalia, which had suffered 85 home burglaries between 1974 and 1975. From 1976 to 1979, he worked as a police officer in Auburn, in the Sacramento area, his patrol routes running through the exact suburban corridors where the East Area Rapist was breaking into homes. He knew the response patterns because they were his patterns. He knew the surveillance perimeters because he had set them. In 1979, he was fired. Caught shoplifting from a drugstore, a hammer, and a can of dog repellent. He walked out of policing and into a warehouse job, and the murders continued for 7 more years. Then they stopped. He married, had daughters, divorced. He lived quietly. He retired. His granddaughter sometimes visited the beige house in Citrus Heights. The investigators who placed him under surveillance in the early months of 2018 were watching a 72-year-old retiree live out the last stage of an ordinary life. He moved between the house and the car. He ran errands. He puttered. From the outside, there was nothing, no visible sign, no behavioral tell, nothing that distinguished him from any other elderly man in any other California suburb. He had no idea the people watching him knew what they believed they knew. He had been careful for 4 decades because being careful was the thing that kept him safe. In retirement, with nothing left to hide from, the carefulness simply looked like routine. He dropped a tissue on the ground outside his house. Detectives retrieved it. A second sample came from the door handle of his car. Touched, discarded, unguarded in the way you're unguarded when you believe the war is over and you won. Both matched the DNA from the Golden State Killer crime scenes. Every sample, every case, Every county, every decade, every victim, the same man. The net closed in the space of a discarded piece of tissue. On the morning of April 24th, 2018, law enforcement surrounded the beige house in Citrus Heights before sunrise. They waited. The street was quiet. Somewhere inside, a man who had once moved through sleeping neighborhoods with a flashlight and a mask was asleep in his own bed, unaware that this was the last ordinary morning he would ever have. When DeAngelo stepped into his yard, t-shirt, cargo shorts, tube socks, thinking only about a roast he had left in the oven, they moved in. He offered no resistance. He protested in what witnesses described as a high-pitched voice about the food he had left cooking. He was placed in handcuffs. The man who had whispered threats into victims' ears for a decade said nothing else. The man who had spent 40 years calculating how to disappear had nowhere left to go. For the next 2 hours, alone in an interrogation room, he sat in a plastic chair and stared at fluorescent-lit walls. He had no lawyer yet. He didn't know exactly what evidence they held, how far back it reached, how many counties had his DNA in their files. He sat and breathed and perhaps calculated, the way he always had, the way a man does when he has been calculating his way out of rooms for 40 years. And then, believing he was alone, he spoke. I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives. On June 29, 2020, because a pandemic had made courtrooms impossible, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder inside a university convention center large enough to hold all of them. The survivors, the families of the dead, the detectives who had worked the case across 4 decades. He sat in a wheelchair. He wore a face mask. He was 74 years old. The rapes he had committed in the 1970s could not be charged. California's statute of limitations had expired, but the plea agreement required him to admit to them anyway. Prosecutors read the details of each attack into the record out loud in that convention hall, while the people who had survived them and the people who had lost someone to them sat in their seats and listened to their own histories spoken in a legal proceeding for the first time. He had to hear them too. That was the deal. Then the survivors spoke. Jane Carson Sandler had been raped in 1976 while her infant son slept in the house. She stood and faced the man in the wheelchair and described, without euphemism, what he had done to her and what living with that had cost her for 44 years. She told the court she had been frozen in fear beyond description. Phyllis Henneman had been the very first rape victim in Sacramento. 1976, the early days, before anyone even had a name for what was happening in the eastern suburbs. She was in chemotherapy when the hearings began. She couldn't attend the initial proceedings. But when DeAngelo was sentenced, she was there. She came in during treatment and sat across that convention hall and watched. A prosecutor who was there described the expression on her face as a twinkle. For the first time in 40 years, he said later, she got justice. Jennifer Carroll, Lyman Smith's daughter, walked to the microphone and spoke to the man in the wheelchair directly. She told him about Gary, about 40 years of carrying that morning, about being investigated at 18 for a murder she didn't commit. She said she had lived with the shame of it for decades. Then she told him it was his. It's your shame, Joe. DeAngelo rose from the wheelchair. He removed the face mask. He stood there, 74 years old, the man who had terrorized California for a decade and then vanished into ordinary life for 40 more years, and spoke. I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Then he sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. What happened in the weeks and months after the sentencing is harder to describe than the sentencing itself. For the survivors, there was no single feeling, no clean catharsis, no moment where 40 years of weight simply lifted. Some described relief. Some described rage they hadn't expected to feel after conviction, as though the verdict had unlocked a door that had kept something contained for decades. Some described exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of people who had organized their entire adult lives around the absence of an answer, and now had to figure out how to live with one. Jane Carson Sandler, who had waited since 1976, said that finally seeing his face, finally attaching a name and a history and a courtroom to the whisper she had heard in the dark 44 years earlier, changed something she couldn't fully articulate. Phyllis Henneman said there was no such thing as closure. What there was, she said, was release. 3 months after the sentencing, Phyllis Henneman died from cancer. Jennifer Carroll continued writing and speaking publicly about her father and stepmother, about Gary, about what the case had cost her family across 4 decades, and what it meant that a database built by genealogy hobbyists had finally done what 40 years of professional investigators could not. She did not describe that irony as bittersweet. She described it as exactly right, that it was ordinary people, millions of them, sending in their saliva samples out of curiosity about their own histories, who had finally given her family back theirs. Jennifer Carroll continued writing and speaking publicly about her father and stepmother, about Gary, about what the case had cost her family across 4 decades, and what it meant that a database built by genealogy hobbyists had done what 40 years of professional investigators had not. She did not describe that irony as bittersweet. She described it as exactly right, that it was ordinary people, millions of them, sending in their saliva samples out of curiosity about their own histories, who had finally given her family back theirs. Michelle McNamara's book came out on February 27, 2018. She had been dead for 23 months. 2 months after publication, DeAngelo was arrested. The book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was already #1 on the New York Times nonfiction list. It stayed there for 15 weeks. Patton Oswalt accepted the recognition on her behalf and said things about his wife that made audiences understand why she had been the person who refused to let the case go cold. When the Sacramento County Sheriff announced the arrest, he was careful to note that McNamara's work had not directly produced the tip that led to DeAngelo. Her co-authors and her husband disputed the framing. The methodology, GEDmatch, the genealogy tracing, the surveillance, had come from investigators. But the name Golden State Killer, the public architecture that kept 50-year-old case files in the cultural conversation long enough for the genealogy tool to exist, that was McNamara's. She kept the pressure on. She kept the story alive. She made the case feel like an open wound when it could easily have calcified into historical footnote. The title of her book came from something DeAngelo said to a 15-year-old girl he was raping in her home on the night of December 18, 1976. Her parents were at a Christmas party a few blocks away. He had been inside her house for hours. Before he left, he held a knife to her throat and spoke in the guttural whisper that his victims would spend decades describing in depositions and interviews and nightmares. "You'll be silent forever, and I'll be gone in the dark." He was wrong about both. There is a specific cruelty embedded in this case that 40 years of headlines have only partially captured. Joseph DeAngelo was a police officer. He studied criminal justice, not as a curiosity, but as a professional education he then used to commit crimes. He knew response times. He knew how blockades worked. He knew which routes were unwatched and when. He used everything the system had taught him to stay ahead of the system for 4 decades, while simultaneously living inside it. Driving a patrol car through the same neighborhoods he stalked, issuing the same radio calls he monitored during his attacks. And then he walked out of policing with a shoplifting charge into a warehouse job, into a quiet beige house in a Sacramento suburb. He had daughters, a granddaughter. He retired. His neighbors found him unremarkable. That's what 40 years looks like from the outside. On an ordinary morning in 2018, in tube socks, on his way to check a roast, he stepped into his yard and discovered that the thing he believed he had escaped had been building toward him the entire time. Assembled not in a crime lab or a federal task force, but in a database full of people who had mailed away saliva samples trying to learn whether their great-grandmother was Irish. The case is closed. The man is in prison. But Phyllis is gone, and Gary still carries that morning, the comforter, the pillow, his father's face. And somewhere in the public record there are 50-plus case files belonging to women who survived, who went home from hospitals and gave statements and rebuilt their lives in the full knowledge that the man who attacked them had walked away free, who were told for decades that the evidence wasn't enough, that the system didn't have a way to reach him. It found a way. He is exactly where they said he would be, right where Michelle McNamara promised him in the last pages of the book she didn't live to finish. Gone in the dark. Joseph James DeAngelo is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. Michelle McNamara's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published posthumously on February 27, 2018. Her husband, Patton Oswalt, dedicated it. For every victim who survived and every victim who didn't. Brian Maggiore, 21. Katie Maggiore, 20. Lyman Smith, 43. Charlene Smith, 33. Keith Harrington, 24. Patrice Harrington, 27. Robert Offerman, 44. Deborah Manning, Manuela Withen, 28. Cherry Domingo, 35. Gregory Sanchez, 27. Janelle Cruz, 18. And the 50-plus who survived, who waited 40 years, and who finally got to say his name